So I think perhaps the first unexpected part of this is that I'm white. But that's okay. it's a reasonably easy story. My husband's sitting up in the back over there. All right, so the topic of our discussion today is video games and social change. All right, now what do the following things have in common? Australian refugees, transgendered people, and natural disasters. Now, these are all things that have had video games made, topics that have had video games made about them in the last 10 years or so. Now, this is, of course, the topic of our discussion, socio-political video games. Now, the really common misconception is that video games, firstly, are a child's frivolous pastime, so it's a waste of time. It's either that or that video games are evil and violent and our children should not be allowed to play them. Now, I'm really hoping that if you're attending a discussion like this, that firstly, you know that both of those are incorrect, and secondly, that you are at least open to a third possibility, and that is that video games can also be used to challenge existing stereotypes and can be used as a means of critical development and socio-political change. Now, South Africa actually has a very thriving indie game development community. We've got a lot of different indie game developers producing a variety of really cool and very interesting different games that sort of really challenge a lot of these sort of stereotypes. And although today we're actually going to be looking at a number of international examples, it is important to point out because we have quite a unique and different game development scene locally. Okay, but now, what can we learn from video games? Now, those of you who are gamers will know that this is Call of Duty Ghosts playing behind me, so it's sort of the quite typical video game that we're sort of particularly familiar with, but I think what we can really learn is that interactivity can often communicate a point in a more effective manner than traditional means of communication. So a scholar called Patrick O'Rourke argues that in many ways an interactive experience has the potential to leave a greater lasting impact on the player, especially since you aren't just passively viewing it. You're in the thick of things and making choices that have a lasting impact on how the story plays out and how you will experience the consequences of those choices. Interactive experiences will always have the ability to affect players more thoroughly than passive experiences. Now, the real question, I think, for many people, particularly possibly people attending here, is why? Why use a medium that is traditionally associated with frivolous, time-wastage entertainment, and increasingly now, in recent years, controversy. But the simple answer to this really is because it's accessible to today's youth. Today's tech-savvy generation relates to this kind of medium, and in order to be able to get a point like this across, it becomes very easy because they engage with it a lot more. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole third world access to technology debate. I think that's a completely separate argument. And so we're going to just assume for today that all urban city-dwelling youth have at least either access to video games or at least familiarity with the concept of video games. So it makes sense then to communicate in a way that they can understand. Another indie developer, Paolo Perdicini, argues that it's great to see more and more game makers coming out and saying, this is what I think and feel, this is how I see the world, and I decided to express it in a game form. But I'm also interested in works that can contribute to the public debate beyond self-expression. I want to see games and simulations being used to make sense of the world around us. I want to see them next to text or moving images and not in an ancillary role. I want to see more journalism, more philosophy, more history education, more experimental geography conceived natively for interactive media. I think the role of a socially conscious game designer is to foster this type of critical play. So how do we carry over the notion of critical gameplay into our contemporary society, particularly into a South African context? Now, in the lead up to the elections, I think there are a number of issues that continue to be relevant and important to us in our day-to-day life. Now, obviously, 2014 elections coming up next year, and there are things like strikes, corrupt politicians, poverty, racism, service delivery, and crime. And those are just some of the topics that are pertinent to us as South Africans. Now, would it be possible to address those issues in a contemporary and relatable, interactive manner in order to impart understanding to people wanting to understand these issues and the issues that are facing our country? Now, there are currently no South African games that I'm aware of that look at these issues, but there are South African games that deal with a variety of socially conscious and socially critical issues, which we'll get to in a little bit. But so first, I'm going to have a look at a couple of international examples. So the first is a game called Escape from Woomera. It was made in 2003 in Australia. and it basically attempted to expose what life was like for immigrants living in Australian detention centres. And the reason that I use this example is because there still, in 2013, still has not been one other game that addresses the same issues, even though images of other Australian detention centres have now made their way into the media. Likewise, American immigrant detention policies have also attracted a great deal of attention with a game called Homeland Guantanamos. So if we had to look at something like that, how would we apply it to a South African context? So I think a very sort of simple and easy example is perhaps to look at the Xenophobia Riots from a few years ago. Imagine playing as an immigrant in South Africa, being faced not just with the hardship of leaving your country and relocating to a country for whatever reason, whether it's looking for jobs or because of war or whatever, but now being faced with hardship and hatred from the country that you have now moved to. There's another game called Riot. It's an Italian game, currently in development, and it focuses on the increasing number of riots in Europe at the moment, Greece, Italy, Egypt as well, particularly around unemployment. And in this game, you can play as both the protesters and as the police. So you can play on both sides of those. You can address issues as the police. How do you handle it? Do you perhaps try and respond to a riot with force? Do you try and use less force? As protesters, is it a peaceful protest? Is it always the intention to be violent? And again, I think a local example is something like the Marikana shootings. Imagine that you were, as a minor, faced with these armed police, or alternatively on the side of the police, perhaps you have been either ordered to fire, or perhaps you're a young, inexperienced policeman who's actually just scared. So now this is not to say that there are no South African games that deal with this. So this is a game called Eskom Energy Planner. So you obviously have to manage Eskom's grid. There's also a student game called Giving, Giving, Gone that specifically aims to connect with people and to promote empathy. Now, all of these are issues that they need to be handled with care. You need to be sort of socially and critically sensitive to the discourse that you're engaging with. But now, in order to demonstrate my points, I have come up with a theoretical game that deals with the elections. So 2014 elections are coming up next year. Imagine a game that allowed you to engage in political strategy and try to win the 2014 elections. So you play as either leader of the African National Congress versus Democratic Alliance. The objective of any game is to win. So to woo voters and win the 2014 election. Now, it's a strategy game, so you need to consider a variety of different factors over here and how best to defeat your opponent. Now, before the game even starts, before you even start campaigning, you have to pick your advisors. So obviously, if you're in government, this would be your cabinet. If you are campaigning to win and go into government, this would be your party. And let's say that some of your advisors are not necessarily as qualified as they should be. And you now have to assign them roles. So perhaps you assign somebody, you make a really bad decision, and you assign somebody who's a specialist in agriculture into the role of education. Obviously, they're not going to give you very good advice because they are not familiar with education. So how do you win a game such as this? Well, you'll need to consider a variety of factors. Now, there are three main criteria that you need to meet. So you don't really need to meet all of them, but in order to win, you need to win in at least two of these. So the first is the people's trust. Do your people trust you? How popular are you? And service delivery. That of course, is the all-important one. Now, it's obviously a greatly simplified version, but it'll serve for the moment. Periodically, corruption will creep into your party. Your party members will start to take bribes, and how you address it ultimately will impact whether or not you win the election. So do you clamp down on the bribery, or perhaps you let it slide? If you clamp down on the bribery, obviously your people will trust you more, but perhaps your party members won't like you so much because they're not getting kickbacks. But if you let it slide, it's going to become more rife, more people are going to start taking bribes, and that your trust in terms of your people will go down. So the consequences, again, the consequences of your actions, and it's about a ripple effect. How will something like that impact on the outcome of the election? There are a number of different ways that you can win votes. The first of those is service delivery. Provide people with what they want. You can hold rallies, so you can inspire your people. And lastly, and this is my favorite, you can cheat. So if we go through all of these individually, obviously service delivery is about delivering your things like education, water, electricity, fixing the potholes in the roads, all that kind of stuff, or you face the dissatisfaction of the population. If you don't deliver, your people are not going to be happy. Rallies, you can only hold a limited number of rallies per campaign, and you have to time those rallies quite quickly because they provide a very short-lived boost to your popularity. So perhaps you hold one right at the beginning so you make sure that people remember you, they remember what's going on, and you hold one right at the end because that inspiration will push your voters to vote for you right at the end over your opponent. Okay, cheating. Now, cheating, I think, in general is quite a sort of controversial issue in gaming. Okay, I'm just going to go with a personal anecdote quickly. In some narrative-based games, I don't really have a big problem with cheating, like looking at things like walkthroughs. If I'm stuck, I don't have a big deal with it. My husband does not like that. He absolutely will not cheat. He can be stuck on a level for months and months and months, but he will not cheat. But I suppose from a philosophical point of view, if you look at it like this, oh, I have claps, yes, he'll be very happy. So from a philosophical point of view, obviously you can win votes more quickly if you cheat. But ultimately, your people will distrust you more. So it is all about that balance. I mean, yes, perhaps you could, at the end of the election, if you know that your trust of your people is really high, you could kind of do that. But do you really want your people to think that of you? So what happens if your opposition party overtake you? How do you deal with it? Perhaps you slander their name, or do you actually try and improve your service delivery to prove that you're the better party and people should vote for you? So now the results of something like this, what do people take away from an experience of a game like this? Why would you go and play a game like this? Now, why would you produce one? Now, part of that, I think, is you can educate people about partly how difficult it is perhaps to run a government, and also about the kind of people that they would like to see lead them. What does it say about, I mean, it's a simplified version, but what does it say about elections and politics and the sort of ripple effect that all this kind of stuff has? One bad decision can impact your entire campaign. Now, ultimately, for me, gaming is about fun. And how can you take a medium like this and use it to educate and serve as well as entertain? And I've chosen the picture behind for a reason. This was the game that got me into gaming. This is the game that changed everything for me, that I played and thought, that's what I want to do with my life. And my argument to everybody always is, and people sort of say to me, oh, but I'm not a gamer. I'm like, no, you are a gamer, you just have not found the right game. Thank you.